What's up, everyone? This is Mike Casu, and you're listening to the Brute Strength Podcast. This week, I interview Chris Spealler, one of the most iconic CrossFit athletes of all time. We talk about his career in CrossFit, competing as an athlete, as well as his transition into a coach and what he's learned throughout that whole process. Before we get started, if you're a regular listener of this show and you haven't done so yet, please put this show on pause real quick, head to iTunes, leave me a quick review. I'm going to invite any of you that are interested to call into a voicemail that I have set up and leave some questions. So then I'm going to play back your question on the podcast, and I'm either going to answer the question myself or I'm going to get one of my guests to help me answer those questions. If you're interested, the number is 801-449-0503. That's 801-449-0503. I hope you enjoy the show.
Hi, my name is Darren Hansen. I'm a recent hire over at Mass Athletics, so working with Nick Fowler over there. Pretty sure you're familiar with him. So, question, training, the squat, okay, basic, right? So with clients, obviously it depends on the client, or does it? What's the proper squat depth? Do you push athletes to an inoptimal position to reach a full depth? Or do you preach toes forward and squat to the depth capable? Or how do you go about that when working with the client? Also, toes out, toes forward. I mean, that's always a fun one to talk about, and how it applies to, sport application as well as just in the gym, training, CrossFit style applications. Would love to hear some talk about that, and that's it.
Darren, what's up, man? Thanks for calling in. Yes, obviously, I'm very familiar with Nick Fowler. Anyway, I'm going to get my buddy Chris Spealler to help me answer this question. And I think I learned some of the answer to this question from Chris years ago at the CrossFit Level 2 certification. So I'm interested to see how his answer has either stayed the same or evolved over time. So, Chris, what do you think about this question?
Yeah, I think it's one that it's cool that he's addressing, because it's, I think, one that sometimes people can overlook, or it's easy to kind of get lost in maybe the gray area. But in short, I want it all. So when we think about the points performance in the squat, regardless of whether we're going for a more athletic type squat where it's sport specific, or maybe just a more well-rounded squat, we can kind of dive into that. Think about points performance for me. I think about weight in their heels. I think about knees tracking their toes. I think about hip crease below the knee, which is full range of motion. And then, most importantly is a flat back or a strong midline. So with that though, I think it's easy for us in the CrossFit community, and I think really any fitness community, kind of get wrapped around the axle of one way is the only way. So if I think about those 4 points performance, what I like to do with my athletes is think about what stance and what foot position is going to allow those things to happen. So some athletes, I might have to have them stand with a wider stance. Some I might have to have them toe out more, some more narrow. There's a lot of things that go into that, like ankle mobility and hip mobility and awareness and all sorts of things. But ultimately, I'm going to put my athlete in a stance that allows them to achieve all of those points performance. If for some reason we have someone working with that, maybe they have some kind of pre-existing injury or limitation or impingement, I personally don't think we should take them to depth if we sacrifice other things. So I would work with that athlete and continue to work on getting them lower while keeping their weight in their heels, their knees out, and their back flat. So that's kind of the approach as far as just the overall thing. And then the toes forward bit, that's kind of in the past has been a hot topic. And I think that comes from people talking about optimizing position to create torque and things like that. But again, I think that is kind of the end state, maybe one of the last things we can think about And as far as sports specific athletes, that may have a little bit more transfer, a little bit more carryover, depending on what the athlete is. But I also think that using both styles, I guess you could say, of squatting have tremendous value depending on what our goal is with our athlete.
Right. And one thing that you actually taught me, like I alluded to in the beginning, and that CrossFit level 1, level 2 trainers are huge on, is this term triage. And
Yeah.
some of the things that, it's okay to push people to get lower in the squat as long as you aren't sacrificing certain things that are related to like overall safety, such as your lumbar spine being in a neutral position, as well as your knees, right? You don't want you don't want to push someone so low in a squat that it causes their knees to cave in. Those are the two big ones that I would watch out for. And if you're loading it, if it's anything heavier than an air squat, then you also don't want that. You don't want your chest to, be coming too far forward. You don't want that, your hip to be too flexed, because that's going to produce a lot of stress on the spine that's really unnecessary. So until that person can, has the ankle and hip mobility to keep their chest up, you probably don't want to load it and make them go lower and lower and lower. But yeah, hope that helps, man. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
What's up, everyone? This is Mike Casu. This is the Brute Strength Podcast. This week I have a pretty obscure athlete named Chris Spealler. Most of you probably have never heard of him. Chris, thanks for making some time for me, man.
Yeah, man, my pleasure.
Obviously, I'm just kidding. Chris is one of the most iconic athletes of all time. And actually, I'm going to start out with this. I was probably a year into, maybe 6 months into my CrossFit career, and I started going to a nutritionist to try to put on some size. I think I was 165 pounds, and I wanted to put on some lean muscle. And I said, one of my goals, she asked me to do some goal setting, and one of my goals was I told her I want to beat Chris Spealler in the Open next year. I think
that's awesome.
Yeah, I think this is around. This was when it was still sectionals, right? And I had never competed in the Open or anything like that. But she kind of just laughed straight to my face, and I went on to do the zone diet, and it worked really well. But from the very get go, I looked up to you. You were really close to me in proximity. You were in Park City. I was in Salt Lake City, and I looked up to you mainly for the way that I saw you competing in videos and stuff, and kind of how you carry yourself in general. And I see you as you've always been such a consistent athlete, and you seem to rise to the occasion and kind of suffer, have a higher pain tolerance than everyone else. So
Thanks, man.
I'm wondering, and those are like kind of superhuman traits. And I think I really like to humanize people on this show. So I would like to ask, like, did you ever have any self-doubt when you were competing?
Yeah. What's funny is I think I did for sure. But I struggle with that more when I was wrestling than I did with CrossFit. I think wrestling, in high school and through college, I learned to kind of deal with those demons, so to speak, early on. And that really helped prepare me for much of what I didn't know was coming, but much of what I experienced with CrossFit. And so for sure, self-doubt was a role, but it played a piece. But I often enjoyed like being the underdog in CrossFit. It took pressure off of me and gave me a chance to kind of, I guess in essence, prove everybody wrong in a way, which I liked playing that role instead of being like the front runner,
Right. Yeah. It's interesting you say that. 2 years ago when Brooke won that regional, we had conversations exactly like that. Like, she felt like no one respected her. And we knew how fit she was. And so she had this huge chip on her shoulder. And that year she just completely dominated. So I think that's really interesting. I wonder, do you have any, now you've gone on to train and coach some very high level athletes. Have you figured out any ways to try to instill that into those athletes?
That's one of the things that's been interesting in this transition kind of phase in my life as I've gotten into coaching. Is coaching is obviously very different than competing in the sense that I know how I tick and I know what I need, but athletes are so different, and the athletes that I've worked with in the past, some are super hands-on, some aren't very hands-on at all. So one of the biggest challenges I've faced as a coach is just kind of figuring out how athlete ticks and like what makes them motivated, what gives them passion. um, and that's been one of the toughest things because everybody's different. So I think identifying, though, I talked a little bit about this in the past, but I think helping people identify why they're doing it can be a really big piece, because I think a lot of people do it either aimlessly or because my buddy's doing it or because I feel like I have to do it. But if we start to identify kind of the root of, hey, why am I competing? Why do I really want to compete? Then I think that allows us to have some purpose behind what we're doing. We can set better goals, allows us to have some passion and drive. So those things I think are really important. And without answering why, we can't have that productive training environment.
Right, because then if you don't have that sense of purpose, then it's all very superficial, right? And so then the mundane things and the hard times, there's really nothing to really go back to that really keeps you in it, right? If you're not very clear on what that purpose is, then it's really easy to skip the skill work or skip the recovery or take a day off. But if you can tie everything back to that sense of purpose, that why, then you're able to be a lot more consistent. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, 100%. Because I mean, let's be honest. For those of us that have experienced or are coaching or have dealt with people training at an elite level, training can often not be fun. Like it's just hard. It's hard work and it's difficult. And sometimes it can be lonely. Sometimes you can feel alone. And depending on the environment that you're in, it can be tough. So without identifying those things, it's just so much more difficult and it's so aimless. So yeah, like that helps you without a doubt through the ebbs and flows of training, which are normal. It's easy for athletes to, I think, slough it off and try to act like every day is a great training day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reality is that's just not true. If someone's like hitting PRs every day, and it's just not true. It's like the social media. Everybody looks great on social media, but no one sees the failed attempts before the lift.
Right. Well, it's funny. It could be that people's definition of a successful training day is just off a little bit, right? In my opinion, a successful training day isn't necessarily one that you hit a PR or you necessarily get physically better at something. Like in terms of like motor learning, like motor development, the plateau is like that constitutes the vast majority of our time spent learning anything. So I think a successful training session is one that you are present, you're sticking to your program, and then identifying where you could have gotten better and like just learning from that, right?
Oh, for sure. And I think that's one thing that I struggle with as an athlete is that, you know, there's a difference between a training day and a competition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of athletes feel like a training day is still competing. And it's this mentality that we have to PR or we're not improving or I have to, make progress. And I think we look at progress as very tangible things. So a number, weight on a barbell or a time on the clock. But like you said, I think there's still tangible things that are maybe less noticeable, intangible things that are more the mental aspect that I think really play a big role in creating a successful training atmosphere and just training session in general. And it's really hard, I think, for some athletes to identify that.
100%. Adi taught me about that more than anyone. Just they call it. So her company is nutrition consulting, and she calls it different measures of progress. So usually people just measure their progress in nutrition by losing weight or, losing body fat percentage. But what they help people identify is like, how consistent are you being? How many times are you coming within like a certain percentage of hitting your macros? Like if you look at all of these different measures of progress, then from a psychological standpoint, it helps you build so much more confidence. So if you take that into the gym, into your training environment, like, how is your recovery? How is your sleep? How is your hydration? How, can you quantify your recovery? Like if you put all of those different facets of your training under the microscope, then there are so many more ways to, show progress, which I think is so beneficial for athletes.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, so what you'll hear some coaches or athletes refer to it as, I think, is just the 1%, and that's one thing that Ben used to talk to me about occasionally, because I think all of us are head cases as competitors, but it's just like, hey, if we can get 1% better every day, in 100 days we're 100% better, and that 1% often isn't necessarily the stuff that happens in the workout in the gym, but like you said, it can be the recovery or the nutrition or just the mentality that we had when we were working out, or maybe it's the camaraderie, or there's so many variables that matter when we think about training at a higher level. And I think we need to pay attention to those to be successful.
Absolutely. So a couple years ago, you stopped competing, and I'm guessing, is that the first time in your life that you were no longer like a highly competitive athlete?
Actually, no, there was like a window of kind of just being a lost soul and a ski bum
Before CrossFit?
about, yeah,
Gotcha.
after wrestling and before CrossFit.
So what did that feel like? And maybe it was the same both times. I'm not sure, but what did that feel like a couple years ago? Kind of wrapping your head around no longer being a competitive athlete.
I think I was a little bit more well prepared when I finished wrestling in college. That was kind of like the last highly competitive thing I had done. And I didn't do anything for probably another 5 years or so until I stumbled into CrossFit. And that was really hard. There was a big, I guess you could say, like almost like an identity type,
Yeah.
not crisis, but just, man, really difficult transition in who I was and what I love to do. And so when I transitioned out of competing in CrossFit, I kind of had an idea of, okay, these are the red flags of my identity's too wrapped up in CrossFit, or I have my priorities right. So I had a good perspective or understanding of what to expect, which I was really grateful for. But it was still a long time, transitioning out of competing and into more of just workout for my health and fitness for what I do outside of the gym role. It took me probably a good close to 2 years to really settle into what I really wanted, and identifying kind of that why for me now, as opposed to competing. And I would say the first 6 months were the toughest.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, it was just kind of learning how to get back to having fitness in the gym, make my life outside of the gym better, and not having fitness in the gym be my life.
Right. Man, I can relate so much to that, and especially probably your earlier experience, because I stopped when I was 23. I had that spinal fusion done when I was 23, and that was for sure the first time I had ever, gone through something like that. And I for probably at least a year, I was scared to really train hard again, because I was almost embarrassed for not. I think I told you about a little bit of this at lunch the other day, where I felt embarrassed for not being in as good of shape as I was when I was competing. You know what I mean? Like I felt like people would judge me and that they would think less of me. And so my solution to that was to just straight up like not train in a CrossFit gym. And if I did, just don't train with people who I thought might beat me, or, it was a very, I don't know, like cowardice type approach. And I was just really fearful of what other people would think. And come to find out, people don't care how good you are at CrossFit. The people that matter to me most don't care how good I am at CrossFit. And it just
Yeah.
took me a while to really, realize that and wrap my head around that.
Oh, for sure, man. And I think that, like, yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's just, even still, we're doing like this fun little intra gym comp type thing with Icon, and I'm just throwing my hat in the ring to be a part of it, and just have fun with the crew. And there are guys and girls that are just smoking fit. They're
Mhm.
just crazy fit, and I just don't train like that anymore. So
Right.
when I post my time, even still, it's still like a sense of vulnerability and a sense of, I hope they don't judge me.
Hmm.
And I think that it's like the blessing and the curse. It's what made me push and made you push, I think, to get to the level that we were. But it's also something we have to learn how to kind of temper and rein in. Otherwise, man, it sure can take control if we're not careful.
Certainly. Do you find that people treat you differently since you stopped competing?
No, and that's one of the things, if I could encourage anybody that's kind of going through the same process, is that was a fear of mine, and it sounds like it was one of yours as
Hmm.
well. But being on the other side, more often than not, what I hear people say is when they ask me how it's been not competing. My first response is, it's great. I can do the things that I love to again, and I'm getting outside again. I have more time with my family. I can focus on my business more, and things like that. And the next thing that comes out of their mouth almost always is, yeah, man, you got nothing to prove.
Hmm.
And it's just like, I don't even feel like that, but other people feel that way about me or for me. And that's
Right.
just such a relief, I guess, for me, and just kind of a privilege, right? To have people feel that way about you.
Absolutely, man. I definitely see you that way, but I can relate to the feeling like I feel sometimes like I still have something left to prove, but it's nice to hear that kind of thing for sure. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Thanks, man.
So now you've gone to coach hundreds, maybe thousands of athletes over the past couple years, and eventually I want to get into like really dive into the coaching side. But
Yeah.
knowing what you know now, if you could go back, what is there anything you would change in your approach as an athlete?
With competing,
Yes.
man, I don't know. Things have evolved. I evolved with CrossFit,
Hmm.
So I think I was really fortunate to be in the right place at the right time and also work crazy hard. Um, but looking back, I honestly have no regrets at all in my training at all. I sometimes wonder um, what different types of volume would have looked like for me. I sometimes wonder maybe like what different structures would look like, but I definitely don't have any regrets, and I definitely don't think I would have changed anything. It's more just the curiosity in me as kind of a coach and someone that programs now than an athlete.
Gotcha. I gotcha. So since yeah, so you've like you said, you've evolved in the sport. You've been at the very highest level for a long time. What do you think is the biggest misconception the average Joe CrossFitter has about the elite CrossFit athletes and even what it takes to get to that level?
I think now the biggest misconception is just like most people, I don't think they realize what it takes to get to the games. I think that there's still a pretty big disconnect between this sense of, oh, I love CrossFit and it's awesome, to, hey, I'm going to go to the CrossFit games.
Hmm.
And sometimes people say that and they're like, yeah, I want to go next year. It's like, whoa, 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 pump the brakes, because most of the people that go to the CrossFit games, not all, but I'd say the majority of them, they don't they didn't just stumble into CrossFit this past year or two. Like they did other training for generally a specific sport, and that might be football, or it could be baseball, or it could be a host of things.
Hmm.
So they have experience with strength and conditioning already, And now they're just taking that a step further and applying that toward more of the CrossFit methodology. So I think sometimes people get a little bit ahead of themselves with what it really takes as far as the amount of time to accumulate the strength required, the conditioning required, the drills and skills required. It's just so much now. So that's one piece that I think that people often kind of miss. And then I think the other one is the outside variables. So I think, you hear people say, oh, to go to the CrossFit Games, it's kind of a full-time job. But I don't think people realize that that's not just training in the gym, right? That's like a full-time job, as in I need my nutrition dialed in. So every meal that I eat needs to be with purpose, right? Or it needs to be done, for some people, weighed and measured. It means that I need to make sure that I'm taking care of my body, so that I might have to do body work every day, or a couple of days a week. It means that I have to do mobility. It means that I have to have, probably for people with higher volume, I know I was sleeping like 10 hours a night. So it's all these outside things that people need to take care of as well, and not just the training inside the gym. How's their lifestyle, and does it support the goal that they want? Because I think most people have a hard time making that adjustment.
I couldn't agree more. And I think there are definitely exceptions to that rule, where there are people getting away with a shitty diet or, a lack of recovery. But
For sure.
there are almost zero of CrossFit Games athletes, for sure, and most regional athletes. There are almost zero of them that have like a very stressful outside life, where they have like a really stressful job or a really stressful like home life or whatever. Like, most of these athletes' entire lives are structured so that everything revolves around them training and performing at an optimal rate, right? So everything else
Yeah,
is minimized.
for sure. And I think that that's required now, for people, especially athletes that are at the top of their game and trying to go to the CrossFit Games, like strong contenders to go. And I think that's really cool. I think it's great that people are able to make that jump or that change. And I think it's cool the sports evolve to that. But I also think that those are often the things that are less talked about. And it's more, oh, what's the perfect program, or
Right.
how do I get stronger fast, or how do I improve my conditioning? One of the answers might be, well, honestly, man, like, you might have to change your job because the hours that you work don't condone, the productive training environment, and it's just too stressful.
Right.
And wow, that's a hard thing to do.
100%, man. I honestly, everything that you've just said, I think applies to at least 75% of even regional athletes now. Like, it's becoming so competitive. Like, even regional athletes are, if they have a serious job, it's coaching, a handful of CrossFit classes a day. And a lot of them are only coaching like 2 or 3 classes a day, and the rest of their day is training and recovery.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. And it's funny because you can see the difference in the heats. Like, you can see, not that I know their outside lifestyle by any means, but like, there's a significant difference between the first heat that rolls out at regionals and the last heat that finishes. It's like, it's almost a different athlete, and the guys and the girls that end up going to the games in those top 5 places, or whatever it ends up being, compared to the bottom 5, there's a pretty massive gap there.
Right.
And I think that a lot of the things we just talked about are generally like the game changers and the difference makers for those people.
Right. So you and I talked about a few days ago, committing to a program, and you were telling me about your upbringing a little bit. I'm wondering, would you mind sharing? And we were talking about like committing to a program, and how you can basically just be told what to do and commit fully to a program. So I wonder, would you explain to people kind of like how you learned that, like how you acquired that skill?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is from wrestling, and I know, that conversation we had when I was in a sophomore in high school. I had been wrestling since I was about 6 years old, so I had a lot of time under my belt, and I was at this kind of crossroads where I was trying to figure out: do I want to do wrestling because I like it, or do I want to do wrestling and find out how good I can be at it? And my high school wrestling coach, he was never a real great technician or great teacher, but he made us work super hard. And he showed a video um, from the University of Iowa and their wrestling team. And I remember watching these guys train and their whole mentality. They were good technicians. They knew how to do things well. So it wasn't like they were slouches as far as wrestlers, but their whole mentality was that they would outwork people. So a wrestling match is 3 periods, and there would be a number of these guys that would be behind by 5, 8, sometimes 10 points going into the third period. And they would just completely outwork their opponent and just wear them down. And they'd end up coming back and winning. And I saw the way that these guys trained. And when I looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh, like I want that. I want to do that. I want to be that. And it boiled down to this mentality that it really didn't matter what I was doing. It was just that I knew I was going to work harder than everybody else. And if I worked harder, then my chances of beating you were just increased.
Right.
And I think that really fed into that mentality of, some would call it like that racehorse mentality, where it's just, you tell me what to do and I'll do it. And thankfully, when I was working with Ben, we had a really good relationship. So we would work together on a lot of that stuff, and I would tell him, hey, this isn't working. And he would be very flexible and would change things. And other times, I just rely on him entirely to give me guidance. But I was very much a person that, hey, tell me what to do and I'll just put my head down and go to work.
Right. So what do you think about all of the cherry picking that's going on today, right? There's so many different like free sources of programming out there,
Yeah.
and people posting these fun workouts on Instagram. Like what do you say to people like that? And how do you get them to commit to something?
I guess it depends on your goal, right? If someone's just doing CrossFit because they love it, right? Or they're training just because they love it and they want to experience a bunch of different variety and they're just doing it to be generally fit, then yeah, do it. You know what I mean? Like, go check out all the workouts that you want to try and write them down and throw them into the mix and just do them as you go, because the reality is, you're still going to get more fit. You're still going to improve on some level, but if your goal instead is to possibly pursue more of the competitive realm, then depending on the level of what that is, especially at the higher levels, I think it's really, really important that people stick with the program and trust the process, because otherwise, if they start to bounce around, um, they might end up jumping into different programs at different times of cycles, or the entire thought process of why they do what they do from one program to another could be different. And I just believe that adaptation takes time, and without giving ourselves a chance to adapt, I just don't think that we will ever fully tap into what we would be potential to do if we don't give ourselves a chance to try things for. Usually I would suggest people give things a shot for at least a 3 or 4 month window, depending on what kind of cycle's going on.
Yeah, I love that, man. And I think it's really even more tempting because you see people at the very top continuing to get better with, a lot of people say they're creating their program on a day-to-day basis and they have all this variety. So I realize that it can be so tempting. But going back to what we were talking about before, earlier, most people don't know how those guys grew up training, right? They don't know about their
Yeah.
training history, and that take for instance Matt Frazier. He was a weightlifter, and he followed a periodized program for years. He was a nationally successful weightlifter, and that's how he trained for years, and that's why today he's able to do and train the way that he does. Rich is the same way. He grew up playing sports. He was a strength and conditioning coach at the college level. Like that, I know for a fact that's the kind of training he was doing. You know what I mean? Like he had a periodized program, and now he's able to add all of this variety and continue to get better because he has such a great base. And a lot of people just don't have that base to be able to get away with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I still think, depending on the program, I still think like that concept of variety can be super effective. I just think it has to have purpose, so I think
Certainly.
that, I think that variety can be really a tremendous value, even for strength, especially when it comes to CrossFit, because I think that it's interesting. I was talking to a buddy of mine about it. I was actually talking to Chan about it. And, we were watching some of the guys at Wadapalooza, and I think this kind of tide of events, or just this trend, has kind of happened, which we've all seen it, but we were watching some of the guys in the intermediate category, and there's some strong dudes in there, like really strong,
Mm-hmm.
And I told Matt, I was like, man, it's so crazy to see guys that struggle with just the straight up CrossFit stuff, and then at the end of these 2 or 3 really difficult pieces, they walk up and hit 255 on a snatch, and they're in the intermediate category.
Right.
And Chan was like, well, he's like, really? And he brought up a good point, which I totally agree with, is I think that people have gone so far into this side of, well, I have to be strong because everybody in CrossFit's strong,
Mm-hmm.
that they've forgotten, well, how do I apply that? So now you see athletes that maybe are kind of in these intermediate categories that still have maybe very similar levels of strength to the top CrossFit athletes, but what they don't have is that ability to apply it toward a workout where, you just finish a 400-meter sprint, and now you've got to do 30 squat cleans and 15 ring muscle ups like we saw this weekend at Wadapalooza. It's like, well, that's a different story.
Totally, man. We were talking a couple days ago about getting people to buy into a program. What can people, gym owners included, as well as coaches, what do you think they can do to improve the buy-in of their athletes?
I think understanding why, and I think that was a really cool part of that conversation that we had, is if someone asks us, hey, why do you have this part of the programming going on, or what's the goal for today, or what are we trying to accomplish? If you don't have an answer why, chances are someone's not going to be as invested in you, because that to me is a sign that you don't really have much direction in what you're doing. But if we can answer that person, hey, here's why we're doing that, even if it's for just this workout, or maybe it's during a microcycle or a mesocycle or whatever, but if you can answer why, I think that's a really helpful piece to just allow people to understand that it's not just haphazard programming.
Right. And it really, it helps them to own their programming, own their training, right? If they understand why they're doing it, then they have a whole different relationship with their training.
Yeah. And to progress, right? Mm-hmm. I think people, whether you want to call it a benchmark or a testing phase, I think those are important to show people the progress and say, hey, here's where you started, but now 6 weeks later, this is where you are. Right. I think that stuff is really, as far as a buy-in, man, a benchmark or testing phase can be super helpful.
Certainly. And that's a huge mistake that we made early on, just asking people to blindly trust us for, this huge amount of time, where, if I think about me as an athlete, if someone would have tried to do that with me, I never would have stuck to that program. 1, I have to know why I'm doing something, and 2, I have to know if I'm improving or not. So we've started to incorporate all of these, either live cast or webinars, explaining the why on a micro and macro level, as well as incorporating all of these different tests throughout their training cycle. And it sounds like you do the same thing.
Yeah, I think that live interaction and helping people understand what that is super important. And, you know, you have to, especially when you're thinking about, you know, the programs we're talking about, you're trying to cater toward a really broad audience. So I think it's important to, you know, figure out how, okay, instead of now, how does one athlete tick? Now I've got how many athletes that I need to figure out, right?
Right.
So I think almost in the sense of more information is better, because those that want it, they can get it, and those that don't, they don't need to invest in it.
Right. What is one belief that has changed in the past couple years since you stopped competing?
Sorry, say that again.
What is a belief that has changed in the past couple years since you stopped competing?
Oh man, that's a good question. Aside from kind of the earlier conversation where we thought, you know, gosh, are people going to think less of me? That's definitely something that's been debunked. You know, that is a change in thought process or a change in my belief there. But even more so, less is more. Productive training is so valuable, and I find that with myself. I'm not as fit as I was 100%. I'm just not, you know, but the cool thing is I still see most things very similar to when I last left competition. And in some phases of my training, I've PR'd my lifts that I hadn't for 3 or 4 years. So I really think that depending on the athlete, depending on where they are with their previous background and what their existing goals are and their lifestyle is, gosh, just less is more with a productive and intentional training approach, as opposed to this thought that, well, you know, if so and so is doing this, I need to do more, which is funny because that's where that wrestling mentality
Right.
came in for me. You know, that's the way that I thought. But as far as training in this way, which is different than wrestling, I just think the importance of productive and purposeful training, it can't be overlooked, because otherwise I think athletes stagnate or they just get burnt out way too fast.
Right. I mean, honestly, it's almost harder to show up for a shorter training session or a lower volume program and give more effort than to just go through the motion of more work. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally.
It's
I mean,
almost a
all of
cop
us
out
can.
for some people.
It is. All of us can say, "Oh, well, I have these, you know, 6 parts to my training session today." But how many people say, "You know what I did today? Like, I had to take my time to warm up for it, and dude, it sucked, but I did Kelly, and I did it in 21 minutes, and I was on the floor afterwards."
Right.
I feel like that's so rare now, because a lot of people just think, oh, well, I'll do Kelly in 30 minutes and then I'll do my strength session after that. And then I'll do the gymnastics piece after that. And then I'll do another EMOM, and then I'll do another workout. And before you know it, you're just running in mud.
Right. Certainly. The only part where it gets tricky is preparing people for the big competitions, right? Where recovery in between workouts becomes paramount. Is there what are your thoughts on that in terms of volume?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had this conversation with some people in the past. And I think here's the question is, so check it out. Most people, their goal, a lot of people now make it the goal just to get to regionals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to take a step further, people wanted to go to the games, or maybe someone just wants to do well in the open. Well, check it out. The open, it's one workout over the entire course of the week.
Right.
So guess what you better get good at? Throwing down at one workout. For regionals, it's only 2 workouts over the course of 3 days, right? Or I guess I should say 6 workouts, right? So 2 workouts a day. And I know there's like usually an additional part scored there, but there's usually 2 workouts or 2 sessions each day.
Mm-hmm.
Most people train more than that, you know? So it's like, I sometimes wonder, and I get it, because we have to train to have a well-rounded athlete, right? And there's so many parts to CrossFit and so many parts to competition that sometimes training just takes time. But if we think about the volume required in some of our more high-level competitions, even regionals, it's 2 sessions a day. Now, the hard part, like you said, I think, is once we start to get into something like the CrossFit Games or maybe other competitions that require more volume, then it does get tricky in saying, okay, well, what does that look like? How do we increase our recovery? And for me, what I found is I would have to increase my volume during each day, but that would also mean that I had to add in more rest days.
Right. I love that. If you could teach your athletes one physical thing, what would it be?
Oh man, one physical thing. Gosh, I think because I think this is one of the hardest things. I don't know that you can teach it, but speed. Like if you ever see people with like that have a hard time with like explosive power, if I could teach that, oh man, that'd be awesome. Because some people just have like slow hips,
Right.
and that's so hard to, I think, change that motor pattern
It's
and
fun.
that
Right.
the ability to fire different muscles, I
Right.
guess.
Yeah. To a certain extent, I know that speed is genetic, but it's funny. I think visualization and simply just being around very fast people can actually make you significantly faster. Going into Coach Gail Hatch's and watching Matt Bruce lift when I was still competing, just seeing how fast him and others in that gym moved, I instantly started moving faster. So I think being around fast people, it gives you this new sense of not only what's possible, but what's required to be a good weightlifter or a good sprinter or a good jumper.
Yeah,
So I think, either watching YouTube videos or surrounding yourself in an environment of, people with elite speed can be a very effective way to train it. But other than that, it's one of those things that's largely genetic.
it's tricky. Yeah, that, and I think just the simple just body awareness, the ability to, and I guess that would be more athleticism, which again can be trained, but is also, I think, a genetic thing. That athleticism, if you have someone that can kind of shift gears with motor patterns and things
Mm-hmm.
like that quickly, it's such a game changer.
Yeah, this is totally just opinion, but I feel like it's true. I think a lot of that comes from either playing sports or just moving around and being physical as a kid. Don't you think?
Yeah, and I think that's the difference now we see is kids that get plugged into one sport too
Mm-hmm.
early. I think they're losing a piece of athleticism. If all a kid does is play baseball from the time he's 6 until he's, 24, and he never did another sport, I think he misses out on a piece of athleticism. Where instead, what if he, played baseball, but he also played football, but he also wrestled, and he also, ran track or lacrosse? All of a sudden, you have this kid that, my gosh, how well rounded are they?
Right. Yeah, I mean, if Khalipa had played multiple sports growing up, I think he would have won the 2010 games or the 2011 games if he could throw that softball.
Right? Myself included, for the love.
Oh man, I don't remember yours. I remember
uh,
his
That's
and
why, because you
Malleolo's.
saw, yeah, you don't remember mine because Jason was immediately after me, which was my
That's
saving
funny.
grace.
That's funny. Um, what about non-physical? If you could teach them one thing, between the ears, what would you teach?
Mental toughness. I mean, that's got to be it, right? I think that's a really difficult one to teach because I think people have to kind of find that on their own in some ways, in many ways. But yeah, mental toughness is hands down the the best thing someone could have.
Right. Well, I think you actually touched on exactly how to build mental toughness, and it's not just like this like sharpening the iron per se, but really just having a clear sense of your purpose. You know what I mean? Like people that have a greater sense of purpose are going to go harder. It means more to them. So if some people it's going to take getting out a pen and paper and writing that down. It might take a discussion, or it might just be simple as sitting down, allotting some time to really just think about what your purpose is for exercising or competing or whatever it is that you might want to do. So I think you answered that question earlier.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Um, just to wrap it up, what is one thing most people don't know about you that you wish they did?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think probably that um I think most people see me, as just like the CrossFit guy, right? Rightly so, because that's
Right.
the community. But I think what I wish people, or I think what people are starting to see more of, is just my passion for just sport in general.
Hmm.
Not just CrossFit. I love CrossFit, and it's awesome. But I think since walking away from competition and stepping back, I've got a renewed sense of um, just appreciation for the ability to just go do whatever I want. As far as sport, my fitness lends itself to me being able to go ski or downhill on my bike, or, I mean, anything, go run a marathon tomorrow if you want to, even though it's not going to be a great time.
Hmm.
Just sport in general. I my encouragement to those of you guys that are listening out there and that maybe are kind of in a phase of life where you're trying to figure out if real high level elite competition is your jam or not. Don't forget how much fun sport is. Sport is, I think that's what all got us into CrossFit.
Hmm.
Um, and getting back to it has been a real joy.
It's so cool to hear you say that. My one of my New Year's resolutions is to play more this year. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna take what you said to heart for sure.
yeah, it's a good life, man.
Right, and it's not necessarily something that's going to, um, have some like tangible effect on your productivity or your success per se. But I think what it does is, you really can't see it, right? But it makes you happier, and it allows you to be more creative, which is in general going to make you a more successful, happier person.
Yeah, and just keep going back to the why. We talked about for training, but what about life? Like why? Why? What do I want? Do I want to look back in 15 years and say I wish I would have worked more? Or do I want to look back in 15 years and say, man, I'm so glad that I experienced all the things that I did. I don't think many people look back and say, man, I wish I would have worked more.
Right, or I wish I would have watched more Netflix.
Yeah, yeah.
Unless you haven't seen Game of Thrones, you should definitely watch a little more Netflix.
The- you can work hard in the gym, play hard outside, and earn your Netflix at night.
That's it, man. Anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
No, just thanks for having me on. And my encouragement to you guys is just is exactly that. Start to think about your why. It's easy to get wrapped up in what others do. It's easy to get wrapped up in expectations just because I think we place them on ourselves or we assume others have them for us. But um, let your training support your lifestyle and don't let it override and consume your life. It should support your lifestyle. So think about what that looks like, and guys like Mike and myself are here to help make that happen for you.
I love that, man. It's been, as I said in the beginning, I got into this sport really looking up to you, and it's been such a pleasure getting to know another side of you, and just seeing how down to earth and willing to give your time and teach others and stuff like that you are. So, again, now I look up to you in a whole different light, and I think people are going to walk away from this with a lot of valuable information.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. Where can people find out more about your program and keep up with you?
Yeah, so just iconathlete.com. That's where all the information lives on there. We've got all sorts of info and videos and podcasts, and honestly, just trying to learn from guys like yourself, and continue to make that just a really great community vibe. Social media, that's Icon Athlete, and then personal stuff. It's just C Spealler. usually for Instagram and Facebook, stuff like that. Yeah. And we'll just keep pumping out the content and info, and hopefully people find it fun and valuable.
Hell yeah, brother. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good, bro.
All right, Chris.